Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security at the Heritage Foundation. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com. My guest today is Andrew Phelan. He's a return guest, thankfully, an Australian medtech entrepreneur and writer with a strong background in international affairs. Some time back, he was an advisor for the China Council at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. He also has a tie to Johns Hopkins Nanjing Center, somewhat similar to my tie to Johns Hopkins SAIS campus in D.C. He's lived and worked extensively in China, focused on cross-cultural engagement and innovation. Today, he combines that expertise with his work in the health technology sector and his insights on U.S.-China relations, global business, and future of medical innovation. But most importantly, today we welcome Andrew back to the China Desk to continue our conversation on all things Australia, the U.S. alliances, and of course, China Desk. So Andrew, welcome back to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Hi, Steve. Great to be with you again. That was a long-winded introduction and a long way of saying here's a guy down in Australia that likes to talk about China.
Well, indeed, but we had great listener and viewer response to your previous episode. We encourage the audience to go to that ChinaDeskPodcast.com website and look in the show archive. Somewhere in the early 70s, you're going to find Andrew's name, and that's where you can get a little bit more on what we usually do with our China Desk guests and talking about some of your personal background to get a flavor for the human we're talking to. But today, Andrew, we're going to do something a little different and really jump right into our conversation, because we'll never have enough time to talk about all that we want to talk about with you. And frankly, from the last time we talked, so much has happened. But I want to begin first with things Australia, and then things sort of through the lens of what's happening with your prime minister's tenure there, with an eye towards tying these back to China, since we are the China Desk. And then over the course of our conversation today, we'll get into things strategic, U.S.-China, some of the highlights of 2025 as we start looking into the challenges of 2026. But with that, Andrew, I know that you had a particular poignant experience having to do with Bondi Beach, a place that people who are familiar with Australia would have known of, but now has international infamy in a certain sense because of recent tragic events. But maybe share a little bit about what your personal anecdote was in that geography and the friends that you were spending time with, and what it really means to Australians, because I think that a lot of the world doesn't have an innate sense for what this particular place really means to everyday Australians.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. It's been a weird little period, and weird not in a good way. So I used to live in Sydney, in the eastern suburbs. Bondi Beach is Australia's most famous beach. There's a show that goes around the world called Bondi Rescue, which covers the adventures of our lifesavers on Bondi. When I was living in Sydney from 1999 to 2004, quite often I would go for a surf at Bondi, sometimes very early in the morning before work. And I hadn't been to Sydney for quite a while, actually. So I was reacquainting myself with old friends, and I went up to do an ocean swim, the Bondi to Bronte. This year they reversed the order. It's about a 2.2K open water ocean swim. And I went up and stayed with an old friend of mine and his family. They happen to be Jewish, and I was privileged enough to join them for the Shabbat dinner on the Friday night, and their son read the prayers before dinner. I'd been training at Bondi on the Sunday a week ago, the day before that, beautiful weather, and I was swimming up and down Bondi, and I stopped to watch my friend's son on his paddleboard doing his life-saving skills. And so, Bondi represents, it's an iconic place. The beach is iconic in Australian culture, and so is swimming. And Bondi is an iconic place in Australian culture and in the life of Sydney-siders. And so anyway, I did the swim. I had a great swim, actually, with in very tough conditions. And Peter Stefanovic, who I'm normally jumping on Sky News with, it was his first swim. So we'd never actually met in person. We met on the sand at the end of the swim, and it was a great atmosphere. And then I came home to Melbourne the same day as the Bondi massacre. I was on an early flight down, and I was having dinner with a friend of mine when the phone call came through, and I just honestly, it still hasn't really sunk in yet, that this kind of thing could happen here. But a lot of people are very angry because I think what's happened, you can't directly relate them. That's not the point. But there's been an environment fomenting where there's too much oxygen, too much space being given to people saying the most horrible things. And I'm talking about radical Islamic imams, And funnily enough, I heard the same sort of stuff in the UK when I moved there from Hong Kong to the UK in early 97. And I remember thinking, 4 years before 9/11, I remember thinking, how are these guys able to say this sort of stuff? Why aren't they? Singapore, which has a Malay Muslim population, has zero tolerance for that sort of stuff. In fact, I think it was about 2016, there was an imam from India who started having a go at Jews and Christians in his sermon. He was charged. He had to publicly confess. He was fined and he was deported. So there's I think we ought to be looking at what Singapore did, because what happened in Bondi was the unwritten contract, the social fabric that binds Australia together. We don't care we respect your tradition. You go about your own way. We all get along peacefully, right? That's the Australian way. That fabric was torn to shreds a week or so ago in Bondi.
Certainly painful to watch from afar. Just a shocking reminder that not everything happening in the world is driven by the United States of America or our president, that there are some trends that are out there that we need to take very, very seriously, and allies need to think about what we're doing collaboratively to meet these challenges, and maybe take a step back from some of the tropes in our politics that sort of where the words get in the way of real action. And that brings us a little bit back to the China angle on this, because China generally would fall into that broader category I was trying to lay out there. And when it comes to sort of the information environment in Australia, not limited to Australia, but you're there and sort of our friend on the scene to help give some perspective. What would you say about the role that China, the CCP, the United Front has played in whatever way, or technology-wise, in terms of this permissive environment that led to what the travesty was that we've all witnessed, and the spread of anti-Semitism?
Yeah. Well, recent studies have shown that younger Australians have more anti-Semitic views than older Australians. And we know that people under 30 don't read the broadsheets. They don't watch legacy news anymore. Where are they getting their intel? Where are they getting their info? How switched on are they in terms of what's going on in the world at the moment? I'm very curious to know. I'd love to get in front of, some younger audiences. But they're getting their info from TikTok and other social media, but largely from TikTok. And we know for a fact that since October the 7th, 23, ByteDance, Beijing, or PRC Inc. has weaponized TikTok, to generate biased views in that conflict. They've been consistent in that respect from the get-go. And I think that environment has, been conducive to some of the views that we've seen, particularly on university campuses, the age of a lot of protesters that are in no way linked through family to either anywhere in the Middle East, but, it seems to be cause or fashion du jour to be out wearing your kaffir and yelling out slogans in the city. This seems to be somehow fashionable. And I think that environment hasn't been shut down. I think it's frankly negligent or irresponsible. We have a duty of care to our young people to make sure that they have access to good information, and then their brains aren't being influenced in a malign kind of way. And so I think we have to take a step back and say, if you look at Beijing's actions in the Middle East since the atrocities of a couple of years ago, very clearly from the beginning they picked a side. They've been a sponsor of the regime in Tehran, which has been a sponsor of the Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah, quite clearly. And in its rhetoric, China's been critical of Israel in that action. It's clearly taken a side. And so I think these things are all interconnected, they're linked, and to pretend they're not so is naive.
Yeah. Well, this is certainly one of the most important strategic moments of the calendar year when looking at Australia's role in the world and the world coming to Australia. Maybe use this moment to reflect a bit on 2025 and give our audience a little bit of your takeaways from the year in terms of how your prime minister has handled engagement with China and the implications for your own country.
Yeah, I almost started thinking in Chinese. You know how your brain does that sometimes. I was going to say "zongdalai Anyway, our prime minister. I'm very disappointed with him, not just in this respect, but in the overall handling of our country, the direction on China in particular. I strongly believe that the Prime Minister Albanese, the Labor Party, have under his leadership, and he's from the left faction of the Labor Party, and the Labor Party hasn't always been like that, by the way. I think he's got a culture of appeasement towards the China challenge. Not being critical. He shuts down questioning on things like TikTok or the Port of Darwin. He doesn't want to engage those conversations. I think the way he's conducted himself, he's been attending a lot of regional fora over the last year. He had a state visit to Beijing earlier in the year. In the footage, he walked across the room to shake Xi Jinping's hand. When he got there, he said, "Wonderful to see you. Wonderful to see you." Not words that I would use if I had a one-on-one with the PRC leadership. And I think in that regard, we need to be hard-headed and what's the word I'm looking for? Rational in our dealings when we do deal with the CCP leadership. And it's not just Albanese, the former leader of the opposition, gate-crashed a meeting when Wang Yi was here, and he said, "It's an honor to meet you." I think also President Trump's had a little bit of kind of flowery language, a little bit around Xi Jinping, my friend, and that sort of thing. I'm not sure that's partly, I guess, he's trying to maintain a relationship, but I'm not sure whether that kind of flowery language is helpful in the current situation. I think we need to be realistic and hard-headed when dealing with them. But it's a lot of things under that. It's we have Australia's being flooded by PRC-made internet-connected vehicles, both electric and combustion, but a lot of electric vehicles pouring into the country. It's been a massive talking point. Now, in the US, of course, under previous administration, you had a security review of internet-connected vehicles from China, and you've decided not to import them. We've had no review, and Chris Bowen, the energy minister in Albanese's government, was asked that question, "Are you going to do a security review?" And point blank said, "No, we're not." That was the end of story. I think that's negligent. Because these things are smartphones on wheels, and they can be weaponized, they can be backdoored. I think that's common knowledge. And China, of course, this goes back to the broader picture of where China is in the world at the moment. It's a manufacturing juggernaut, but it's manufacturing, 2x of what it can absorb domestically. And so its surplus produce has been pouring into markets all over the world, not as much the US because of tariffs and other factors, but in Latin America and Southeast Asia and Africa, where exports are up nearly 30%, Australia and so on. And I think, I'm off topic a little bit in terms of where this is affecting, but also Europe is starting. Maybe you should come back to that, starting to wake up to this. But I think the other part of where Australia's at, where our heads at, Albanese had a good meeting with Trump in the White House. There was discussions on critical minerals. And so he came away. That was a good week for the country. It was a good week for the Prime Minister. But straight away, Beijing criticised him for saying, hey, you're a hypocrite. You want to have your cake and eat it too. And they're right. They're absolutely right. And so this period of time where, he wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to have a good relationship with the US, wants to appease China. I think that's run out of runway. And in the background, the Deputy Prime Minister, who's also the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, has been working pretty hard to run around and embellish whatever military cooperation we've had with Japan, with the Philippines, and so on. And I think also with the US, which leads to the defence review, the recent defence review. So in the Indo-Pacific, South Korea had a high designation as a more valued ally, if you like, because of what it's bringing to the party. And it's bringing shipbuilding. And so it's going to be a critical partner for the US to ramp up its shipbuilding. Australia, once again, I think we need to do more on defence. I was in Northern Australia recently. There's a lot happening across the bases in Northern Australia that are being refurbished and reinvested in. And that's great. And that's going to be critical for the US defence posture in the region. I think we need to step it up. I think we need to step it up big time. I don't see the sense of urgency from the Prime Minister. And the Foreign Minister had some interesting comments in a recent speech where she said she condemned the false suggestion that Australia needed to choose between protecting its sovereignty and maintaining productive economic ties with Beijing. She went on to say China is our largest trading partner, world's second largest economy, and a key player on climate action. So 2 points I'd make about that. One is there's this mentality that you've got to engage. You have to be engaged. Well, I think the question is, what does that engagement look like? Is it win-win cooperation? Are you sucked into the vortex, entangled in a way that compromises you, which a lot of countries, are in that situation? Can you survive without China? Well, I'm old enough, the first 10 years of my life were concurrent with the Cultural Revolution. And I grew up as a kid in Australia, not wanting for anything. We made more stuff ourselves in those days. We didn't have Temu and Shein, right? So the point about engagement, if you have to engage, what does that look like? What degree of engagement? And the other point I'd make is on China's a key player on climate change. Is it? Is it really? I think China, what China does is it's agnostic on energy modalities, and it goes after what's in its national interests. So it keeps adding coal, it's adding nuclear, and so on. But this idea, because China's leading the world in battery technology, for example, that is somehow, or solar panels, that is somehow kind of, the green warrior for the world, that's a nonsense. A big part of that strategy, earlier on, it was the air quality in Chinese cities was, air apocalypse, terrible. I've been there on those sorts of days where the cities became unlivable. But secondly, China's the world's biggest importer of oil, and to get around that potential vulnerability, it wants to be less dependent on oil, and that's been a key driver of its move into so-called renewables.
But really, they still consume a great deal of coal. And the people who talk about this, China being a core part of climate change, or dealing with climate change, they seem to always edit out the part that the People's Republic is the world's leading polluter. And so that somehow just doesn't factor into the conversation. But over the course of 2025, and we go back to the beginning, there were some questions about the new Trump 2.0 coming into office, where there would be continuity or change. There are some of those big pieces that involve Australia directly. One is the Quad, another is AUKUS. As we get to the close of 2025, it's a resounding continuity versus change when it comes to those big pieces. But there's still, aside from these modalities, and Secretary of War Pete Hegseth went to the ASEAN defense ministers' ministerial meeting in Malaysia, met with your deputy prime minister and defense minister a couple of different times at the very least, and they've had follow-on dialogue throughout the year. All the mood music in that is progress and alignment of interests and values and more, better, faster. We have to see some of the fruits of those conversations. But aside from that, there are still some of these issues that are out there in broader US, broader Australia, China issues that we really need to churn on. You've mentioned a couple. So I want to pick up on a few of them to move our conversation into some of these different areas. One is the nexus of tech and questions of export controls and either decoupling or doubling down on dependency. You mentioned the TikTok, but we also have chips where a lot of decisions aren't really bending the arc away from dependency if you just look at 2025. But how do you see the sort of tech ecosystem and how the world is engaging China in either the right way or the wrong way?
Yeah, so I think when we look back on 25, it should be very apparent by now that we are in a technology Cold War. Absolutely in a technology Cold War. And if you look at when China announces its 5-year plans, they're very strategic. They've gone up the value chain in the last 20 years to more high-tech and more value-added products successfully. And so I think to a large degree, Western industrial countries, and let's cite Germany, for example, have woken up to this very late in the day, and they're in trouble. They're in trouble now because it's very tough to compete against the capacity, the capability of China's manufacturing sector. It's become very strong in high tech, in engineering, and so on. On chips, we had the CHIPS Act under the Biden administration. I think the decision of the Trump administration, along with NVIDIA, to sell the H200 chips to China is a very contentious one. I from the reading I've done, I tend to be of the view that I'm against the sale, and the reason for that is that you're giving your direct competitor a great deal more computing power, and in the current, particularly when it boils down to AI, and let's face it, China will weaponize AI in a military sense as much as it can, as they'll weaponize anything that can be weaponized. That's unrestricted warfare. So in that context, there's some revenue that will come back to it, 25% of the sales and that sort of thing. That looks a little bit like deal making, sale making, transactional. So to take a step back, when you look at the Freedom Day tariffs that were smorgasbord across the world, one could argue that, hey, is that fiscal repair, or is this a strategic long-term answer to the China challenge? Because let's face it, they have a long-term strategy. Therefore, we need to have a long-term strategy in the interests of the collective free world. Because this is not going away anytime soon. There won't be a deal, quote unquote, that fixes everything and this problem goes away. That ain't going to happen. So China's going to be there as a systemic rival going forward, and we're entering. Things are getting more critical, not less so. The other thing, just to throw into the mix, is I think with Jensen Huang, where's he coming from? He was quoted as saying a China hawk is not a badge of honor; it's a badge of shame. I don't like the term China hawk because a hawk is a bird of prey with sharp beak and talons, and it swoops down and gets cute furry animals. So I don't like that analogy. And the reason I don't like it is that it implies that the hawk is the aggressor, on a helpless victim. And I don't see it that way at all. I think that people are standing up for the rules-based order, for our national interest, for freedom, the rule of law, democracy. To me, that's not being a hawk. To me, standing up for people like Jimmy Lai is not being a hawk. And he was sentenced the other day. Shout out to his family at Christmas time and to Jimmy himself. Standing up for that stuff doesn't make you a hawk. So this gets back to, when I talk about the China Challenge, which is the name of my little plug for my new website that's coming up in the new year, hopefully for everyone, if I get all the ducks lined up. It's as much about us as it is about the other, right? It's about how we govern ourselves, how we stick up for our interests and values, And so when we allow TikTok in, when we allow, all this product from Shein and Temu to pour into our country, and we don't ask, where is it made? Did the worker that made that product, did they work in a safe working environment? Were they paid a proper wage? Or do we just say, no, we're not going to worry about that. It's cheap. I'm going to buy it. And I'm not worried about the environmental impact. I'm not worried about they've done studies with fast fashion on Deutschwelle. They looked at some jewelry, that was full of cadmium. We've had vapes in Australia with, that had formaldehyde in them. So, what's government doing to allow all this stuff into the country? And I've been thinking a lot lately about how do you define how to respond to the China Challenge? And I boiled it down to 2 words. Be good. Be good, right? Mm-hmm. Stick to your values, right? Chinese workers deserve safe working conditions and decent pay, right? And if you can't fly to the factory door unannounced and do an audit at any time, then don't buy from them. Don't buy from them. And so I think if we go back to those sorts of things, the world would be a better place. But we would if we stuck to those core principles and values and stick to them, don't compromise them, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in right now. And back to tech for a second, the China PRC exchanges, Hong Kong, Shanghai, they're up, particularly in the tech stock space in the last year or so. And for a long period, they've been languishing. So, Alibaba, for example, their stock price is up, 60% or more, over the year. And so there's been a discussion in the US around regulatory for Wall Street and some of the funds is, a large part of China's rise has been financed by US capital. Are we now at the stage where we need to say, let's curtail that or circumvent it or ban it altogether? And, certain funds are going to be like, we don't care, if you're selling your grandma, we can make a buck out of it. We're going to go after a return regardless. And I think it's time that the US state kind of put the kibosh on that and said, okay, funding Alibaba, that's not in the US national interest. That's not in Team Freedom's national interest. It needs to stop. That money can go elsewhere. We need to look after our own. We need to develop our own capacity, and what would be better, more competitive.
Well, you've hit on a few areas that I wanted to definitely draw you out on to sort of focus on 2025 and going into 2026 and sort of do a state of where things are. One is area you're very familiar with, and you alluded to sort of the market place and where financial markets are, where money is going. And where would you say in that regard, the sort of trends are for money flowing into China, and from where? I mean, we've lived through a period of globalism. We lived through a very optimistic bet on China and where it might go. We flooded them with developmental loans and in direct investment. And then we sort of say we had a sobriety checkpoint and we are in a post-globalism environment. We're sort of trying to redefine, and we have some rebalancing going on with the tariffs and otherwise. But as you look at it, how much is changing or is not really changing in terms of the amount and sources of the market funds that are going into China and the funds that China has access to in our own countries?
Yeah, it's a great question, Steve. The short answer is things have changed. And I think we'll look back on 25 as an inflection point in the parting of the Red Sea. That I've called it the Great Bifurcation. My friend Desmond Shum calls it the Great Divorce. Between the US and China, they've been married for the last 30 years, this engagement. And like a lot of divorces, it's going to be messy. It's going to be in fits and starts and so on. Another scholar, Cleo Pascal, referred to it as kind of deparasiting or deworming, because China gets so embedded into your system in so many different ways. The university education system in the US has been a topic of conversation recently, and so on. I think it's a big 25 is a big shift in the long-term trend. If you look at the last 30 years since opening and reform, this foreign direct investment just plowed into China. Every big multinational in the world was making stuff in China. That's come to a grinding halt for a bunch of reasons. FDI into China has ground to a halt. Nobody's investing in China in terms of building new factories and things like that. And if you look at recent history, take an example like Hyundai, for example, the Korean auto maker, the Korean chaebol that makes cars and other things. They invested in a new plant in China not that long ago, within the last 10 years. They've since shuttered that plant, sold it for pennies on the dollar to the local government, and have exited the market. And that's just one of many, many stories. Look at what China's neighbors have been doing, Japan and Korea. I mean, Korea Inc. has pretty much exited the PRC lock, stock, and barrel. Samsung and others, they've either offshored to places like Vietnam or so on, but they're essentially out of the market. I think there certainly was less index funds and things like that going into China because the economy's slow. So we're in a really weird position right now with the PRC economy. On the one hand, you've had the property crisis, which is estimated to be 7 or 8 times the size of the subprime mortgage crisis in the US, to a ridiculous scale. And that's made a lot of individual consumers, effectively bankrupted them. And so they're not out spending money. They're not going down to the mall. They're not eating out, these sorts of things. At the same time, PRC Inc. continues to put resources after national hero projects, right? So, you quite often see the PRC propagandists bragging about the high-speed rail network in China, which is an incredible achievement. I mean, it's vast. It's 40,000 kilometers or something. What they don't tell you is that 6% of that network is profitable. The rest of it is a great big vanity project / white elephant, and it's a huge debt sink. The Shinkansen in Japan, the whole network is profitable. So China's in a very difficult and interesting position. I want to jump ahead to what this means for potential conflict over Taiwan. But they call it involution, which is this sort of race to the bottom of a whole bunch of manufacturers in the same sector. So we saw this with flat panel TVs, a decade or so ago. Nobody's making super low margins and a race to the bottom. We're seeing this competition between EV makers in China at the moment, and they're doing all sorts of trade tricks to continue sales, incentives to consumers locally and things like that, dodgy practices. They're literally putting these things on trains and getting them into Russia. Russia's not too happy about this. They've dumped more new cars in Russia than any other market, and they're not too happy about it. The junior partner in this alliance, right? So this overcapacity has become an issue around the world. Indonesia banned Temu. Mexico's now putting 50% tariffs on stuff from China because they've got a manufacturing sector that's a huge chunk of their economy, right? I think my prediction for 26 and going forward is that Europe, it's taken them a long time, but Europe is going to get more serious about this as well. Macron, who was just in China, has hinted about this stuff. But I don't think Europe has really cottoned on to the fact of what they're up against and how much of a threat this is. The UK, the Starmer government seems completely clueless in how to deal with China. from the mega embassy. They have no tariffs on imported vehicles from China. The UK won't have an auto manufacturing industry in 5 years unless there's a change of government or they do something. But because the economy is slowing and because there's a lot of young people out of work or underemployed in China, I think it's more conducive, not less conducive, more conducive to a contingency over Taiwan. And
Well,
so
let's move into that, and
yeah,
that'll kind of be our wind down topic
yeah.
of what you see brewing in that regard, because we could have multiple episodes where all we ever talk about is how people think and talk about things related to Taiwan and what's going on with contingencies and will they, won't they, and 2027, is it real, is it ethereal, all of that stuff. But clearly some things are emotion. I tend to see a little bit of a glass half full part of it, in that the first island chain is more serious now about things on their own than at any time previously in my lifetime. And I think that complicates things for Beijing to a degree and might buy some time. But clearly there's also a lot building in this stew. And you allude to some of the indicators and pressures that could come inside China where we can't assume normal rationality. And so maybe as we sort of wind down this conversation, and the audience knows we're going to have more conversations, share with us a little bit about what you see going from 25 into 26 in terms of the pressure building and what we should be watching out for with regard to a Taiwan coercion campaign or otherwise.
Yeah, well, I think the pressure is growing. It's a pressure cooker, and the temperature is definitely rising. You see that on all fronts. If you look at mainland China, a record number of sorties across the Taiwan Strait. So the continued pressure applying them on Taiwan itself. There's a concern about the state of Taiwan's unity and its democracy. So there's three parties in the legislative yuan in China: the DPP, the KMT, and the current government. And some KMT leaders have just been on mainland China for meetings there. The new KMT leader has made some controversial comments. She doesn't seem to be as supportive of the defense spend that President Lai is advocating. That's a concern because a divided Taiwan is much more vulnerable. Yet, absolutely, the temperature is rising. I made the comments that Trump talks about his good relationship with his friend Xi Jinping. At the same time, he's just signed off on an $11 billion arms package that'll give Taiwan asymmetric capabilities in a whole bunch of ways to defend their island democracy in the event of an invasion. You're quite right that other countries in the region are stepping up. I think certainly Japan, that relationship's been in the news a lot lately because of the comments that Senator Takaichi had made, which she just articulated what was widely known. And you can sort of see where this is heading. The temperature is rising. There's more investment in the military. Australia's playing a part in that. Even little New Zealand's playing a part in that, which is welcome. It'll be interesting to see going forward whether India steps up a little bit more, and potentially through the Quad, which I would very much like to see. And I think that's very much in India's interest to have a free and open Indo-Pacific. So I think the likelihood of contingency is growing, not decreasing. And I think there's a tendency for Beijing to move in what you would argue is an irrational way, right? Because when you think about it, if mainland China didn't have this bellicose strategy of we're going to absorb Taiwan, if they just traded with Taiwan, both sides and let them do their thing, both sides would be much wealthier and better off, right? There'd be less tension. But the problem for Xi Jinping is that you can't have Taiwan sitting there as an example because here's a whole bunch of Chinese people with a free media and elections. We can't allow that to happen. And they've also got a GDP that's 3x what it is on the mainland or thereabouts, right? So in the same way that they've shut down Hong Kong, for them, Taiwan is unfinished business. And for Xi, it's a personal thing for him as well. So I think the risk of miscalculation is growing. I think the likelihood of kinetic conflict is growing, and also, and I talked about that have your cake and eat it too runway. The US has got a couple of aircraft carrier groups in the Western Pacific at the moment. It's showing a bit of muscle. It's also showing some muscle in your own backyard in the Western Hemisphere, which China doesn't like either, because it's been having its way there up until the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. So, they're giving Maduro a hard time. He deserves a hard time. It's a horrible regime that's impoverished its people, and they've been exporting oil in contravention of sanctions and so on. So the US is playing a more muscular game in its own hemisphere, which I think is great as well. So yeah, to sum up, I think it's things are getting more, not less risky.
Well, I like your admonition to those that are thinking about what we should do to meet the China challenge. Just be good. We might want to put a trademark on that and make some T-shirts and hats as you plan ahead. So with that in mind, let's give the audience another cue coming in the new year. Not only will be watching what's happening with China's economy, they're going to have a new 5-year plan and all that fun stuff. But even more important than that, our friend Andrew is going to be launching an active website. So give us the China Challenge promo, Andrew, to take us home.
Yeah. Well, I've called my new website the ChinaChallenge.com. I've also got .org locked away. So I'm filling those over the holidays and into January. Hope to have that up by February 1. I am being ably supported by some very cool, people much smarter than me on the cyber front and all that sort of stuff. But I thought it would be a handy thing to dump all my stuff in a one-stop shop so people could see what I'm about. And when you think about it, Steve, I think it's part of our thing on Team Freedom, right? That we need to get our act together, get our ducks lined up, and talk about this stuff. We need to talk about the China Challenge. And I just happen to, have a personal history, where I was, first went to China nearly 40 years ago. I was still 21. So that's been a big part of my personal story. And, I met a guy the other day who's potentially going to be a new China correspondent with no China background. I'm thinking, oh boy, you got to start from scratch. So you benefit from anything from a long period of experience with your hands on the tools, right? In the trenches of commerce. That's where you get understanding and insight from. So, and the other point I'd make is the Team Red, the other guys, they are upping it big time in terms of their propaganda, right? They've got a whole bunch of jaded expats that go that do their batting for Beijing. The Jackson Hinkles of this world. Socialism's cool. Here's a shiny picture of China. Socialism works. Here's a picture of a poor neighborhood in America. Capitalism sucks, right? There's all that sort of stuff. And it's with the varying degrees of sophistication. And, a lot of it's pretty ineffective. But back to my point earlier about the unpainted canvas of the young mind, if that's all they're exposed to is your world and your worldview is forming, then they're painting onto a vacuum, right? And so I think it's really, really, really important, 3 times for emphasis, that there's an alternative to that Team Freedom has a voice. And so, it's no surprise to those that know me that I love talking about this stuff. But yeah, I certainly want to do more of it. And I think it's really important that to get the word out and also to bring my Chinese friends along for the ride. I got so many Chinese friends that are fantastic people back in China and overseas that are not the property of the CCP, and they like freedom and human rights and dignity just as much as we all do. That's why they're universal. So yeah, I'm 26 is going to be an interesting year. Bring it on.
Well, excellent. We definitely want to encourage people to keep an eye out for the China Challenge as another platform comes into the ecosystem and can be an aggregator of the right kinds of thinking, talking, and driving conversations to help us meet this challenge together. Definitely a much needed
and just on that, Steve, the other thing I've been doing in 25 is some public speaking, which I get a real kick out of. because I learn as much from my audience, every time I go and speak to people. I mean, I often start with the slide. We take a lot of things for granted, right? I start with a slide with a topographic map of China and ask people, what do you notice about that map? Because geography matters, and it sort of speaks into the mentality in terms of statecraft. And then I ask people, do you know how to say China in Chinese? And generally speaking, people don't know. So even a basic thing like that is a great way to kind of open a bit of consciousness, if you like. But people come up to me at the end of these things and like, oh, wow, Andrew, well, we how come we didn't know any of this stuff? Thank you so much. I've had an overwhelming response to the handful of public speaking gigs I've done, which have been out in the community. I mean, yacht clubs, rugby clubs, returned veterans, financial conference, whatever it is. And, that's been really rewarding.
That's outstanding. Well, we definitely support the engagement with the grassroots in all of our countries. Very, very vital. So you mentioned something about audiences. We want to thank our audience for joining us for this conversation today. We want to encourage you, if you liked the conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing. Give a visit to ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Check out the show archive. And we want to give a special thank you to Andrew Phelan for coming back to the China Desk and sharing his perspective with us once again. And until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.